3. The Vulnerable Self, Heinz, Kohut, and the Addictions, Martin Weegmann. The work of Heinz Kohut has had a major impact on the development of psychoanalytic ideas, notably in America, and has led to the school of self-psychology. There are important crossover points between his ideas and those of a number of British analysts, particularly those associated with the independent tradition, with Balint and Winnicott as good examples. Differences in language and tradition may, of course, obscure some of these similarities in both clinical emphasis and theory. At its most general, Kohut has offered us a new theory of the self and its development, highlighting many aspects of both normal and pathological narcissism. As is well known, Kohut argued that pejorative and morally tinged attitudes have influenced and handicapped a true understanding of narcissism in psychoanalysis, which has frequently been seen as part of some early stage to be replaced or grown out of by object relations. At an analytic and an everyday level, it carries regrettable overtones of selfishness or self-centeredness. In his view, by contrast, there are separate and equally legitimate lines of development of both narcissistic aspects of the character as well as object love. Narcissism is not outgrown, though in its development there is a gradual transformation from more global and primitive narcissism to more mature forms of self-investment and self-sustenance. The ability to achieve the latter, a state that Fairbairn might have, in different language, described as one of mature dependence, or Bowlby as one of healthy self-reliance, is a major constituent of the sense of security in oneself and the ability to cope in adult life. Kohut developed his ideas through the treatment of patients with narcissistic personality disorder, where he felt that a traditional psychoanalytic approach had made little headway. Although he did not work with addictions, he nevertheless thought that there was some affinity between such a personality disorder and the acting out disorders. Addiction, Delin. Quincy and perversion. Given his shift from placing centrality on the instincts, he reclassified these areas not as merely impulse disorders, but rather as primary disorders of the self. In a primary disorder of the self, there is an assumption that the individual has a major, and not temporary, difficulty in building a sense of self-cohesion or maintaining sufficient self-esteem or vigor. Curiously, just as Kohut moved away from classical Freudian ideas to his own self-psychology. So in the history of psychodynamic thinking about the addictions, there has been a comparable transition from the early analysts, with their emphasis on libido theory, oral dependence and regressive attachment to drugs, to later views emphasizing the importance of ego deficits and the regulation of affect. It is suggested here that this shift in perspective can open up a less critical, more accepting view of the narcissistic vulnerability in addicted individuals and of the adaptive functions which the drug serves for the ego. Clearly, these adaptive or protective aspects of drug taking are difficult for the outsider faced with the devastating negative consequences of the addiction to comprehend, and perhaps can only be appreciated by a careful, though not collusive, exploration of how the drugs fit into the client's internal world. Considerable skills of empathy are needed. Rather than systematically applying Kohut's complicated ideas to addiction, I've instead chosen to identify a number of areas where, in my view, his work offers a helpful or novel perspective. Following an excursion into theory, I have drawn on 2 clinical examples from individual psychotherapy, my supervisory work with other professionals, and examples of the kind of countertransference pressures that arise. This is limited and makes no attempt, for example, to consider how his views might have differing relevance according to different stages of recovery, from detoxification through to more advanced sobriety or indeed maintenance treatments for drug users. The interested reader is referred to the excellent 3-phase psychotherapeutic method of Kaufman, drawing on self-psychology and several other models, and Levin's book, offering a specific application of Kohut's ideas to the process of recovery. Owing to the constraints of space, it is not possible to comment on how fellowship organizations, like AA, NA, and others, help to modify the problematic narcissism of people in recovery, and in particular, harness the power of group affiliation to address vulnerabilities in self-governance and self-regulation. Theory. In Kohut's theory, patients who are narcissistically orientated and vulnerable have chronic problems in maintaining a normal level of self-esteem and are highly sensitive to slights, rejections, or perceived criticism. This may be apparent in vulnerable-looking, thin-skinned patients who are easily bruised, but it also applies less directly in those narcissistic individuals whose character armoring involves arrogance, vanity, or other postures of invulnerability. Freud suggests that the main difference between these broad groups is that the former patients display their wounds more visibly and may present as victims, while the latter display strong narcissistic defenses and project outwardly in an effort to rid the self of any feelings of vulnerability. Traditional psychoanalysis, with its emphasis on drives, defenses, and libidinal conflicts, proved problematic with narcissistic patients. leading Kohut and others to investigate the emergence of specific narcissistic needs through treatment, which had to be approached quite differently from those involving other kinds of mental conflict. He spoke of the emergence of particular kinds of narcissistic transference, or using his later terminology, self-object transferences in which the analyst is experienced as providing a basic function or an extension of the self. To start with, he enumerated two main kinds of such transference. The mirror transference, which is activated through experiences of insufficiently supported childhood needs for acceptance and responsive mirroring by the parents, and the idealizing transference, which is activated from the child's need to feel part of a source of idealized strength and calmness, which an admired parent provides. Kohut progressively formulated the concept of self-objects, by which he meant an experience of objects that are felt to be part of the self and over whom we expect control. Two kinds of self-object correspond to these two transference patterns, which are those self-objects that notice and confirm the child's vigor or greatness, known as mirroring self-objects, and self-objects that the child can in turn admire and feel part of, sharing in the calm or infallibility which they represent, known as the idealized parent imago. The self is a complex achievement rather than an endowment, built up successively, though innumerable interactions with our carers in the past, who are significant to us because they not only meet our physical needs, but also function as our self-objects, responding continually to our psychological needs. Drawing an analogy to the body's need for oxygen, Kohut regards the need for responsive self-objects to be no less essential for normal mental growth and balance. In his words, the child is born into an empathic, responsive human milieu. He expects it. A serious deficiency in the availability or quality of such self-objects will produce, in mental terms, the equivalent to the body being gradually starved of physical nutrients. A cohesive and confident self emerges, by contrast, from an optimal relationship between a child and his or her self-objects, allowing for normal imperfections and frustrations of parenting to be fully integrated. This is akin to Winnicott's ordinary devoted or good enough mother, and throughout normal development, there will be the gradual replacement of the self-objects and their functions by a self and its functions. In other words, the self is able to perform the regulating, soothing, accepting, and motivating functions that it was previously dependent on others to provide. In adult life, a sufficiently cohesive and secure self helps the individual to tolerate normal fluctuations in self-esteem, and so to cope with ordinary rejections, disappointments, obstacles, and achievements. In other words, we develop a normal, though not omnipotent, capacity to withstand the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune without buckling to it. Kohut believes that we never outgrow our need for mirroring and idealizable self-objects. These have a different quality in adult life, but are nevertheless needed both at normal times and in particular during periods of developmental transition or stress. In maturity, self-objects are perceived more realistically and less globally, but nevertheless respond to and provide for our needs in circumstances when the self requires a temporary, though important, degree of support or uplifting. Similarly, in analysis or therapy, according to Kohut, there is not in mature patients a decreasing interest in self-needs over time, but the ability to identify and look after these oneself, or to turn for assistance when needed, is increased. The patient continues to expect that the therapist attend to his or her self-object needs. If, however, a firm and secure self has not been attained, and the self has floundered on the rocks of persistently inadequate self-objects, the person will be less likely to deal with the tests of even normal misfortune, let alone exceptional ones. A person so handicapped may respond to such difficulties as though they constituted a grave injury or attack on the self, and respond with rage and/or fragmentation. Kohut argues that a self-disorder was defined as a structural propensity towards such breakups and serious weakening of the self under stress. We will dwell no longer on the wider theoretical background to Kohut's ideas, but the interested reader can consult Baker and Baker's 1987 review or the more critical discussions by Moratos, Bacall, and Molon. Narcissistic vulnerability, although it would not be wise to apply a single diagnostic category to all addicted individuals. We suggest that what Kohut has formulated with respect to narcissistic personality disorder has most helpful implications for understanding addiction. Some of the phenomena that come to mind immediately from the clinical situation are low self-esteem, self-absorption, difficulties maintaining a balanced valuation of the self in relation to others, and inability to soothe the self in a healthy fashion when tensions arise, and other deficits in self-care. At least some of the relapses following sobriety seem significantly linked to anger, frustration, and other felt threats to the self, during which the person resorts to previous solutions. The term narcissistic vulnerability, as I employ it here, can imply either a global weakness of the self, as hypothesized in narcissistic personality disorder proper, or can apply to more circumscribed areas of the personality in which the individual is particularly compromised, such as in feeling assertive or being able to socialize confidently. In the analysis of the self, Kohut details how, during the course of development, we see a gradual building up of what he terms self-structures through a continual process of transmuting internalization, whereby the individual becomes less dependent on an actual object to perform the function of providing such structures. Self-structures allow the individual to begin to be able to arrive at and regulate his or her own well-being. Yet in early periods of development, or at times of particular stress or transition, such structures are vulnerable and developmental attainments can be reversed or dismantled, throwing the individual back towards greater reliance on external objects. Without self-structures which are sufficiently secured through experience and strengthened by the support of reliable self-objects, no firm self is possible. Kohut argues in the latter case that the child does not acquire the needed internal structure, his psyche remains fixated on an archaic self-object, and the person will throughout life be dependent on certain objects in what seems to be an intense form of object hunger. Such individuals might present clinically as overtly needy, resourceless, or aimlessly searching for something. These more archaic objects are not quite independent objects seen in their own right, but are more primitive self-objects whose role is to provide particular services or functions to the individual concerned. The drug is a self-object. Perhaps in drug addiction, these early archaic objects and object functions become realized in the inanimate form of substances or chemicals. Taking this view, the drug or the alcohol functions to the individual as a replacement self-object. Kohut claims that the drug, however, serves not as a substitute for loved or loving objects or for a relation with them, but as a replacement for a defect in the psychological structure. Artificial self-objects like drugs may be sought in lieu of proper self-structures. And in this case, there is no actual building of or nutrients to the self. The drug is seen as omnipotent, with the user able to conjure and recreate self-object experiences, making it much more difficult to be able to learn from reality. From the perspective of self-psychology, the drug acquires an alternative significance for dealing with life experience. The immediate manifestation of its use may be one or several of the following: an alteration in mood, a raising of self-esteem, an increased vitality or energy, a sense of power or assertion, an intense affective experience, or a nullifying of intense experiences, taking the edge off reality. The immediacy of these effects, the short-term gain, offers a reassuring feeling of control or comfort. Temporarily, therefore, the taking in of the drug can lead to a feeling of triumph over problems within the self. But, however, this constitutes a Pyrrhic victory. Kohut describes how earlier grandiose demands are relinquished throughout development, replaced hopefully by an acceptance of normal limitations, resulting in stable rather than labile self-esteem, and through the internalization of idealized values, the person can sustain encouragement and enjoyment in the self and its achievements. Addicts, by contrast, appear enslaved by the drug with a progressive weakening of other values or interests. The sustenance sought through drugs leads inevitably to further depletion of the individual's psychological resources and, in time, to demoralization. In the restoration of the self, Kohut argues that the narcissistic disorders involve a serious defect in the self, acquired during childhood, and that defenses or compensations are created to deal with these defects. Different forms of self-stimulation or addiction can substitute for growing up, providing false strength or a means of feeling alive and reassured. In his preface to a collection of papers on drug addiction, he goes further to claim that by ingesting the drug, he symbolically compels the mirroring self-object to accept him, or he symbolically compels the idealized self-object to submit to his merging into it and thus to his partaking of its magical power. Tragically, the user disavows either wholly or partially his or her need for narcissistic sustenance from human self-objects, turning instead to an inanimate self-object that appears less likely to disappoint or refuse him or her. The malignant spiral of addiction. The following diagram illustrates how some of Kohut's thinking could help clarify the nature of the vicious circle or spiral involved in addiction. Following this diagram through, we begin with an assumed weakness at the core of the personality, a defect in the self. This is recognized clinically in an abysmal sense of self-worth, in a poor self-soothing ability, and in difficulties mobilizing the self when assertion or self-protection are required. As for the latter, the addicts run many risks of themselves, traditionally explained in terms of self-destructive motives rather than as reflecting wider deficits in the self. Moving further around the spiral of abuse, the various effects of the drugs once ingested provide for a short-lived, New self-state with the person locked into the prospect of an initial high or hit that might correspond to an artificially stimulated increase in self-esteem. This is a mirage, a flawed solution, and as no psychic structure is built, the defect in the self remains. The search for external narcissistic supplies becomes an end in itself, and over time results in the serious depletion and undermining of confidence. Caught in a malignant cycle, the person does not simply return to the beginning of the cycle, but acquires each time round a new confirmation of not actually being able to resolve his or her central problems, and so is in a yet worse predicament. In the diagram, this predicament is represented in terms of a spiral with a chronic movement inwards or downwards. Such self-defeating mechanisms have been amply recognized in other approaches, like AA, in the form of helpful reminders or slogans such as, "We drank for joy and became miserable. We drank for strength and became weak. We drank for confidence and became doubtful," and so on. There is some common ground between this view of addiction and other conceptualizations within the psychodynamic tradition, for example, those of Rado from a relatively more classical framework, or the more recent work of Wormser. Rado, for example, describes the way in which the drug comes to augment the ego and as a consequence distorts reality. When the reverse state sets in, falling intoxication, or the come down, he writes that the ego is shrunken and reality appears exaggerated in its dimensions. In his later paper, he describes the drug's aftermath or withdrawal in the following manner. His situation is worse than before. He feels he must recapture yesterday's grandeur by taking another dose. One might say that in both Kohut's and Rado's theories, there is in drug misuse an implied triumph of narcissism over experience, with devastating results for the capacity of the ego to learn from or to appraise reality. Leon Wormser hypothesizes a cycle of addiction, which emphasizes the centrality of what he calls narcissistic crises as the precipitants of the cycle. Narcissistic crises involve some kind of serious disappointment or collapse in the view either of the grandiose self or of the idealized object. Some adolescents seem particularly vulnerable to such fluctuations. In his model, an individual's emotions regress and aggression is mobilized in the compulsive drug abuser. There is a consequent search for an affect defense in the form of drugs to halt the further destabilization of the personality. Unfortunately, the fact that the user buys only temporary relief of psychic pain and is gratified in the short term makes it more likely that the cycle of drug use is repeated. A note on narcissistic rage. In Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, Cleopatra awaits news of her beloved who has had to return to Italy and where, for cynical and political reasons. He has married Octavia, the sister of the powerful Caesar. It will be recalled that Antony and Cleopatra's vision had been one of combined power and ultimate dominion through their relationship, and through the coming together of Rome and Egypt, other kingdoms would be clay in their hands. When the messenger returns to report to an anxious Cleopatra, she is barely able to allow him to talk, and the messenger struggles nervously to bring to her, through installments, the unpalatable reality of Antony's marriage. When he finally does so, she strikes and threatens him in an explosion of rage, in a fine example of the phenomenon of shooting the messenger. Attempting to defend himself from the onslaught, he calls out, "Gracious madam, I that do bring the news made, not the match." The messenger narrowly escapes the murderous wrath of Cleopatra, who then takes stock of the news. Kohut differentiates anger and aggression from what he terms narcissistic rage, whereas the former has a more circumscribed and directed quality arising, for example, out of a conflict in attaining some goal or desire. Narcissistic rage is more global, and the individual reacts as though his or her entire self is in danger. The individual who suffers such a threat to his or herself wants to destroy the source of the offense and desperately reestablish control, like Cleopatra's violence when her worldview and fantasy are threatened. Kohut argues that the narcissistically vulnerable individual responds to actual, or anticipated, injury with flight or fight. The propensity in addicts to a plummeting of self-confidence and self-cohesion under stress may lead to primitive and destructive reactions of rage. If Kohut is right, the individual's narcissistic balance has been threatened, and the ensuing crisis, which may involve tantrums, self-attack or other violence, is the chain reaction in a desperate attempt to regain control, restore honor, and so on. It is interesting to dwell on the fact that some relapses, even after a considerable period of abstinence, may be triggered by perceived threats to the self, with uncontrollable feelings of frustration or deprivation in which the individual's resolve to change comes unstuck. In such relapses, perhaps, the drug use or alcohol binge is readily used as both a weapon and a defense, with someone or something else often blamed for having caused it. Clinical issues. Individual treatment. The following clinical examples come from once-weekly psychotherapy with 2 substance misusers. a woman on a methadone prescription, and a man in his first year of sobriety from alcohol. Sandy. Sandy displayed acute narcissistic sensitivity with fears of being ignored, rejected, and of not counting in the eyes of other people, including professionals. In fact, she elicited a dual response from professionals of the wish to respond sympathetically, given her plaintive expression of helplessness and subsequent discomfort at the bottomless nature of her demands. The more time given, the more she required. She acquired the tag manipulative as well as needy. On starting psychotherapy, she sought constant reassurance regarding the arrangements for each appointment, and this was understood and interpreted by the author as her feeling that I would drop her from my mind after each session, an example of her fear of not counting as well as an expectation of my lack of reliability. Her insecurity about treatment had a pervasive quality, calling forth the need for considerable patience, and also enforced limits to the therapy. There seemed to be a rapid activation of powerful narcissistic or self-object transferences, including a wish for a perfect understanding of her needs, even without her having to put effort into expressing them. Among the repeating themes as therapy proceeded was a preoccupation with my state of mind, involving the nature of my interest in her, my concentration, even on a minute-to-minute basis, and a fear that she would incur not only my irritation, but a degree of frustration that I would soon find unacceptable. In trying to understand these preoccupations, which for long periods, it was possible only to try to describe and hold, I concluded that they all seemed to hinge on a profound narcissistic concern, both about herself and, through projection or expectation, about me. For instance, there was not only a fear that I would find something unacceptable about her and would want to terminate treatment, but also a corresponding picture of me having a powerful narcissistic investment in myself and my views, and if she contradicted this in any way, I would forcibly eject her from treatment. Among the narcissistic picture of me was the idea that I was proving myself as a therapist, and that I needed to believe that my understanding would always be superior to her own. That I needed the treatment, my treatment, more than anything else, and certainly above her own needs. Also, could she really tolerate a situation in which someone was there to concentrate on her, or would this be too much and she would have to drop out? The need would become the fear, in the manner which is often recognized in the borderline patient who has a terror of driving the other person away. One of the defenses she adopted was of compliance, which seemed partially related to early experiences of an emotionally unresponsive or non-mirroring mother and a father who seemed to tire easily of involvement with her and share little. In other words, a father who might not have been easy to experience as being strong or as being an alternative figure of idealization. Drug and heroin abuse came onto the stage during adolescence and seemed to have supplied a feeling of being able to make an impact on the world and win recognition from her peer group. In other words, a feeling of self-cohesion and a means of raising self-esteem. Once in treatment, reductions in methadone led to enormous fears of being re-exposed to impotent and fragmenting feelings. Methadone, in addition to the physiological role it provided, played a role as a self-object, possibly in Sandy's case to lessen rage and aggression. This was explored at some length in the therapy, the meanings around the provision of methadone. As already indicated, a key dynamic in treatment with Sandy was her experience of me as a powerful and tyrannical figure, understood as a reactivation of an earlier traumatizing self-object. If frustrated in the course of my treatment, I would regard her as the cause of the offense and as such remove her, unceremoniously throw her out, or, through a cleverly disguised pretext, get her discharged and blamed for the failure. Perhaps this was an illustration of how narcissistic rage fears can be powerfully projected onto the therapist, leading to further efforts by the patient to defend the self against possible retribution. The patient then feels they have to take flight or fight. At the same time, in my countertransference, I experienced much difficulty with her tyrannical aspects and around the fact of her wish for perfect understanding on the one hand and her apparent lack of empathy towards others on the other. I gradually highlighted this in the relationship between us, including how she was well able to go for the jugular when criticizing me and the pattern of taking offense and expressing rage at my misunderstandings and oversights. This led her into a particular predictable role as the injured party. The detailed exploration of such narcissistic deflations and rage reactions led to a shift in the transference with a relative lessening of her absolute fears towards me and a greater sense of the legitimacy of her own anger. The gradual interpretation of such patterns and the narcissistic fears underpinning them seemed to successfully contain Sandy and led to a better ability to discriminate feelings as well as an ability to better match punishment to the crime, so to speak, when misunderstandings did occur with me or in her relationships outside. Anger could begin to replace indiscriminate rage and confusion. It is difficult to convey in a brief vignette just how complex were the processes of change and how tenuous the therapeutic alliance at different periods. During one such period where there had been much suicidal ideation, Sandy commented that in working with her, it must be like having to walk through a battle-scarred minefield. I think this was a measure of how much internal damage she had to contend with and the utter devastation that intravenous drug use had brought her prior to treatment. In response, I said something rather like, I think it is very important for you to make sure that I know just how difficult your life and feelings are at the moment. It is like you have to fight off a terrible despondency inside you. But in talking about a minefield, I think you want me to know about the risks that I also face. Maybe a fear that I will be a victim or a casualty as well. Of course, there was much more dialogue. But I think the battleground imagery is an excellent metaphor for being able to talk about the trail of devastation caused by drugs and about the depleted state the individuals find themselves in. Once some kind of defeat has been accepted, perhaps therapists act as a kind of hospital in such circumstances, addressing the patient's state and working with whatever wounds, whatever damage there may be, but they are also negotiators, trying to find the best possible terms of recovery, rebuilding confidence, reducing suspicions. They have, in addition, to help the patient to ward off any rearguard actions by the forces that would invite the person back into drug taking. Finally, for the purposes of this summary, the patient later developed the idea of being a special patient, perhaps with the idea of forming with me a bond of special understanding, possibly based on a deep longing for importance and a reaction against the fear of an object who might be unable to understand or reluctant to respond to her needs. A mirror transference seemed to oscillate with an idealizing transference, but led over much time to the building up of a less absolute, more independent need for a self-object. Treatment came to have a less all or nothing, life or death connotation, though the seriousness of her addiction was acknowledged. No relapses to drugs took place, although she came close. Sandy did make significant strides in building resilience, being able to ask for attention in a more realistic manner, and expecting a reasonable, though not perfect, response from others. There was less global anger or breakup in response to letdowns, with greater ability to discriminate different emotional states, help in naming, and discriminating different affective states had also been an aim throughout the therapy. Peter's early history involved his mother's alcoholism and the absence, through early abandonment, of a father. The quality of his mothering seemed to have been unreliable rather than universally poor, with better periods during which his mother was more in tune and responsive to his growing needs, though these would be lost abruptly when his mother returned to drinking. During longer periods of his mother's sobriety, there was some making up and offers of material compensation. Peter had tried to please others, putting himself second or nowhere, and giving the impression of having to be grateful for any acts of consideration shown to him. His self-esteem appeared tied to the degree to which he could help others with a corresponding disavowal of any right to his own feelings or views. The task during the early stages of treatment centered around helping him to appreciate the molding of his sense of self and worth around other people, based historically on his playing the parent or container to his own mother. She had needed him in many ways as her own exclusive self-object, rather fulfilling the role of what McDougall has called the cork child holding a needy parent together. This imagery may be particularly apposite when one is talking about a child's experience of a drinking parent. In the language of self-psychology, we might talk of bad or negative self-objects. The approach in treatment was not one of conscious agreement with the patient as to how hard life had been, or of any kind of direct reassurance, but one of the careful elucidation of his unconscious needs. This led to a tremendously painful recognition of the legitimacy of his own basic narcissistic needs and his right to exist. The experience of rage through treatment was indeed an important attainment, but proved sufficiently containable not to have led to destabilization or relapse. In patients where the self has been at the mercy of an unreliable self-object, and where the parent has looked to the child as a source of or as an obstacle to his or her own narcissism, the child is likely to grow up overburdened, having little to be sure about concerning its own existence. Drugs can substitute a preferable feeling something over feeling nothing, as appeared to have been the case with Peter's history of substance misuse. When it surfaced, the empty vessel-like existence was intolerable. It also increased the intensity of the transference longings and Peter's difficulty in imagining he could be an important and well-regarded individual in my mind. With patients like Sandy and Peter, but perhaps with most addicts, one hopes to help the individual to rebuild or to acquire what Kohut might have phrased as being suitable endopsychic resources or structures. Supervision. The following vignettes derive from the supervision of psychiatric nurses, who are the mainstay of counseling and psychosocial support in the substance misuse service in which I was based. I suggest that Kohut's ideas can assist the supervisor in appreciating the self-object needs of the supervisee, and how these might interact with and confuse the different self-object needs of the patient. Recognition of these personal needs can reduce confusion, freeing up the ability to learn new things with and from our patients. needing to be needed. A drug worker with a strong identification with being helpful tended to react slightly depressively after seeing patients a few times, particularly after some initial sense of promise had worn off. With one patient, whom she regarded as having much potential behind a self-defeating fade, she became enthusiastically engaged in response to patients' periodic reports of promising developments in outside life, jobs, relationships, and so on. However, the patient's depressed and lethargic side was strong and would sweep over her plans, paved with good intentions, and stimulant drugs provided a boost followed by further stagnation and disinterest. As the counseling unfolded, the healthcare professional's enthusiasm wore off, and her moods seemed increasingly to mirror those of the patient, engagement and disengagement, enthusiasm and depression, following in a less extreme manner the ups and downs of the patient's self-esteem. Some of the patient's material then began to suggest an unconscious recognition of this process and the relationship between them, leading to an effort to keep the nurse interested and rewarded, as though the patient had internalized and now demoralized healthcare professional on top of her own problems. Later on, however, the patient started to miss appointments and act out in other ways. The healthcare professional found it hard to empathize with these self-defeating cycles in this patient, seemingly unable to apply her preferred philosophy of positive thinking, and tended to shift her interest unknowingly to her new cases, in the same way she had done with this patient earlier. Of course, the process was subtle, but there was something about the nurse's tone of reporting that, with some exploration, led into particular underlying schemas of expectation of what a good client should be like. In supervision, this was then developed in terms of the healthcare professional's difficulty in learning about the chronic nature of addiction, the malignant cycle of abuse, and how there'd come to be a mix-up between the patient's needs and the worker's own investments. The healthcare professional was able to start to listen more carefully and cautiously to the patient. I believe that, for the supervisor to be helpful, the professional's own experience of their clients and their own narcissistic needs have to be contained in some way. From this, more reflective counseling can proceed. On my level, a nurse had chosen to work with drug addicts as she felt affinity with younger people and thought she could understand the culture of drug taking. There was, on getting to know her better, a wish to be idealized by her patients and a conviction of being able to be on the same level as the younger patients. On the other hand, she did not want to be seen as a pushover, adopting the philosophy that respect will beget respect in a benign cycle of trust. The nurse frequently used the word trust in her clinical reports. During the course of work with one patient, the nurse found herself strongly identified with the patient in a particular difference in understanding involving the patient and another professional, openly expressing her agreement with her patient and gravitated towards being the patient's champion in the clinical discussions. Like the patient, the staff member tended to see the service system as being unfair. The client felt the nurse was the only person who supported her. Subsequently, some important facts were discovered, shifting the nurse's sympathy towards the other professional involved, and she felt let down by the patient. The nurse found it hard to begin to think about the contribution of a cynical self-object in the patient's mind, which was usually projected outward so that the world would be seen as unjust. Subsequently, the nurse was barely able to contain her own anger towards the patient, part of which stemmed from the patient's emotional switching to an attitude of devaluation towards the nurse. The patient no longer idealized the nurse, and the nurse's principle of respect had not turned the patient round as expected. In supervision, it was suggested that this cynical aspect of the patient was linked in her history to an identification with her father as an aggressor and with his particular techniques of devaluation towards her. One of the traps of a patient like this, particularly when there is an appealing side to the patient, is to fall into the unconscious agreement of you and me against the outside world. In terms of the nurse's awareness, she became more able to see her own need for a particular type of good patient, and how there had indeed been a fall from grace in this case. The nurse's own narcissism and guiding principles had been wounded. Countertransference, a self-psychology orientation, in line with other psychoanalytic approaches. The countertransference reactions of the therapist are regarded as providing important elements of information about the patient, but also give clues as to the sensitivities and propensities of the professional engaged in the work. As is hopefully already clear from the supervision example cited, major problems can and do arise from the interaction between the patient's narcissism or intense self-object needs and the personal or professional narcissism of the therapist. No doubt particular constellations of transference and countertransference arise with addicted individuals. And it must be stressed here that an understanding of this area will be of relevance not only to in-depth psychotherapy, but also to counseling and general psychosocial support. The following list is intended as a possible, not exhaustive, range of the problems involved, influenced by a self-psychology perspective. In each case, I have given a simple heading to describe what might be depicted as the professional starting point. The wish to be able to understand. Patients with addiction often demonstrate a counter-dependent attitude to the treatment, as though they are saying that all their needs have already been taken care of through the drugs. This physical tie to the drug and corresponding inability to turn to a human figure can be difficult for the healthcare professional who may feel overlooked or treated as secondary to comprehend. This may be further complicated in clinics that prescribe substitute medication, like methadone. The professional may experience an equivalent of the spouse's or relative's exasperated experience of not being able to understand the addiction, or even an equivalent to. It is either me or the drugs. Unfortunately, the healthcare professional can play into this process by keeping the patient at arm's length, which cuts short the task of understanding the patient and allows us to put the patient out of our minds. The need to feel effective. Drugs, as we have speculated, act as the preferred self-object to the user. While similar to our first heading, I am particularly emphasizing the individual's reliance on an impersonal or inanimate container. The professional sense of efficacy and his or her ability to influence others through human contact and understanding can be severely challenged by this. Once again, too much emphasis on the medical side of management can serve as a defense against experiencing the many difficulties and time involved in forging a therapeutic relationship with substance. Misusers. The wish to be helpful. Though not exclusive to the addicted patients, we are frequently devalued in our efforts and subject to the complaint that we have got it all wrong. Patients who devalue can challenge the professional's defenses and resilience severely. Devaluations probably impede empathy or the wish to be empathic more often than most other transferences because of the kind of abusive relationship that is implied, and need a good degree of self-observation, confidence, and often the help of a third party for them to be recognized and contained in a therapeutic manner. The professional's identification with being helpful is likely to feel threatened, and so the professional becomes the defensive one. To be respected, to have one's integrity recognized. Related to the foregoing theme, the professional may be on the receiving end of periodic or sustained attacks on his or her perceived values, and often the patients will try to identify a sensitive area of the worker's professional identity. A doctor who is not doing his or her job properly, a nurse who does not care, a social worker who leaves them empty-handed, or a psychotherapist who does not understand them would be examples. Other patients may express this attack through a theme of corruption and mistrust of authority, which can leave even the experienced therapist or doctor shaken and defensive. Some healthcare professionals are tempted in circumstances like these to reassert their own position, sometimes rationalized in terms of confronting the patient. In terms of handling mirror transferences, considerable countertransference strains can arise in response to the patient who can only see their own needs and is expectant of perfect understanding. As with the treatment of Sandy described above, for long periods, with or without accurate understanding, the patient can remain fixated on his or her grandiose self and may, as Kohut argues, experience the therapist as a threat to this or as a foreign body. Some patients will be unable to tolerate the idea that someone else might have a different picture from how they see themselves, as this will be a narcissistic threat. In some forms of mirror transference, such as merging or twinship, the therapist may not be seen as an individual at all, carrying for the patient a more impersonal containing function. Such blotting out of the therapist can be intolerable for the professional to experience if their sense of their own significance as a person is sufficiently undermined. The therapist has to manage many role reductions of this kind and may feel outraged when on the receiving end of a self-object need in the patient, the wish for a realistic relationship. As for the idealizing transferences, some therapists feel uncomfortable with being idealized at all by the patient, if this affronts their more egalitarian preferences, while other therapists may, on being idealized, feel stimulated in their own grandiosity and start to overestimate their powers. More difficult to attain, perhaps, is an optimal degree of acceptance of a patient's idealization and a resilience in the face of subsequent belittlement when we fail to live up to the patient's omnipotent wishes, the wish to make better. Finally, we must not forget that many of our patients will have suffered sometimes enormous actual deprivation in which damaged and unmet narcissistic needs will be an important feature. Basic needs may not have been mirrored or responded to reliably, with the person further handicapped by the rejections of other, potentially idealizable self-objects that might have otherwise supplied some measure of compensation. While the drugs may have given the user the illusion of now being free from his or her past, they actually make him or her even less available to be helped in the present. Rescue fantasies can arise in the professional, and mirroring can be misused to imply a kindly, oversympathetic response. Perhaps the therapist starts to offer more than he or she can deliver. This is dangerous when not identified, as Goldberg suggests. There may be the hidden wish with deprived patients to supply in the here and now for the deprivation of the past. Conclusion. Kohut's work, and that of others who have extended self-psychology offers an illuminating perspective on addiction and its treatment, which can be summarized thus. 1. It orientates us to areas of narcissistic vulnerability and self-defects in the patients whom we see, as well as the extreme defenses against such problems. 2. We are helped to understand the propensity to rage and aggression, often encountered with the user turning to substances as a contradictory measure to reassert control for the purposes of survival. This may reflect the patient's chronic sense of powerlessness. 3. The supervisor and the professional can think more sensitively about the interaction between their own needs vulnerabilities and those of the patient. This can enhance empathy and responsiveness. Some qualifications are also needed. Kohut treated patients with predominantly narcissistic personality disorder. By contrast, there is no general personality type for addicted individuals, though the wider notion of damage to and deficits of the self is one which can be applied to different personalities and temperaments. It is a structural concept. Some individuals have extensive damage to the self, long before an addiction is acquired. The addiction offers false sustenance or structure. On the other hand, narcissistic vulnerability is also a consequence of the addiction, as self-structures are eroded. In many cases, there will be a tragic interaction between the two, expressed in the idea of the malignant spiral. Self-psychology should not be thought of as offering a simple choice between or polarity of cause and consequence in addiction. Finally, I would add that the ideas here do not imply that all substance misusers should receive self-psychological psychotherapy or analysis. Quite the contrary. Substance misusers require a wide range of treatments in both individual, familial, and group modalities. However, the contribution of self-psychological ideas can be helpful even in non-analytic therapy as a framework of understanding. Different clinical approaches that are responsive to the particular sensitivities of our clients can go a long way in facilitating change and in ameliorating isolation and other character defenses in addicted individuals.